Welcome to Crash Landing. My name's Steve, and every episode I'm going to be guiding an intrepid explorer as they crash land on an alien planet. They have 1 hour to choose the 5 books they couldn't live without on their brave new world.
Warning, ship crash landing. You have 60 minutes to enter the archives and recover significant cultural artifacts. Authorization required. Identify yourself.
My name is Niel Bushnell, and I'm a science fiction and fantasy author. I've got an adult science fiction series called the Arkship Saga, which is up to book 3 at the moment, with book 4 coming out soon. And I've also written fantasy books for children and young adults.
Well, thank you for coming on Crash Landing and come to talk about your books.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're very welcome, very welcome. So was it difficult to narrow this down to 5 books? And it has to be 5 books. You can't sneak in extra series like some people have tried to do in the past. Right. I've been a little lenient with some people, but I'm putting my foot down now.
Oh, okay. Oh, no, I've got you. You've gone all fascist on me, have you? Oh, no. It was really, really hard. I kind of... I sat down and thought, this will be really easy. I'll do this really quickly. And I think I had about 10 to start with. And I kept whittling it down and knocking one off. And it was surprisingly difficult to pin it down to 5. And then also trying to think about, not just my 5 favorite books, but also what would be, 5 books that I thought would be culturally significant and maybe kind of have a broad cross section of appeal there. So yeah, you give me a hard task, Steve.
Okay, so tell me about your first choice.
My first choice is The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. It's a book that I'm sure a lot of people have read. Weirdly enough, I've got to confess. My inroad into The War of the Worlds was actually via Jeff Wayne. Now, do you know who that is?
Yes, it's the musician, isn't he?
Yes, exactly. Jeff Wayne's War of the Worlds. I heard that when I was about 6 or 7, and it absolutely blew me away. I was really captivated and drawn in by this story. So my first experience of the H.G. Wells story was through the Jeff Wayne musical version, which I do not apologize for because I still absolutely love it. And I listen to it quite often, to be fair. But the book itself, I found the book years later. I was probably about 12, I think, when I actually read the book the first time. And it's such a fantastic story because it's got a real kind of, it feels journalistic. It feels like you're really there, and it's a real account of an invasion told from the storyteller's point of view. And I reread it once when I was living in London as well, and I went to visit a lot of the places that was mentioned, so it really felt very vivid and real. And it's a book that I keep coming back to, and I read, every few years, and I always find something new and interesting in there. So it's still relevant, even though it's I can't remember when it was published now, but it must be over 100 years now, I guess.
It's certainly been a long time.
Yeah.
The thing is, even when we were growing up, we're fairly similar age. There was a lot of books there that I just never got round to at the time for whatever reason, and I've since gone back and filled in some of the gaps. So I've gone back and read the things like Slaughterhouse 5 and Fahrenheit 451, and this was another one that I was aware of, like you, because of the musical and the TV adaptation. And I think we studied it at school probably when I was about 14, so I think that was the first time that I read it as well. But yeah, the TV thing and the music, that was my inroad too, which I don't think is so necessarily a bad thing, that if people come to the material and then go back to the original through a different medium.
Well, exactly, yeah. I think I do wonder if I hadn't heard the musical version, whether I would have eventually... I guess I might have got round to it eventually, because I'm doing a similar thing to you in that I've got lots of holes in my kind of books that I feel like I should have read.
Yeah.
and I am trying to go through and tick those off the big list. But yeah, I mean, War of the Worlds I think it's still completely relevant today. And of course, there is a new TV series in production now, so I'll be interested to see what they do with that and how they translate it. But one of the things that really appealed to me as well was that there's a tremendous sense of sort of futility throughout the whole thing. The narrator, and I don't think we ever get to hear his name, if memory serves. I think we find out his brother's name because it kind of moves off and talks about his brother's account at one point. But he's not the hero. It's not like a lot of stories where the main character is the person who will save the world and everything else. He's just a character who is a victim of circumstance. These events happen around him, and the solution at the end really has nothing to do with him. He is literally an observer throughout the whole story, and I found that really interesting. And it was one of the first books that I'd read where that had happened. Really, I think everything that I'd read before that had been much more, the classic sort of trope, the classic setting of the main person, the main character is the hero of the story.
Yeah, that's very atypical to have someone that is the main character who doesn't drive the story and is just floating along with events. I don't remember the last time I've read a modern book that has that, to be honest, because people want to feel closer to the main character in some way and to relate to them. So just being an observer, it's very unusual.
It's a hard sell these days, I think, to try and to do a story with that where you say, well, this person is just going to observe the things going on, and really he's changed by it to a degree, but even he's not. It literally is an account of a story. It feels, the character feels very much just like he's reporting on events as they happen, which again gives it that sort of slightly more real edge. It does have still, I feel it has a slightly terrifying edge because it feels much more realistic. It feels grounded in that kind of diary-like structure that it has. And again, this has made me read, The Time Machine and other books of that era as well. So it's fascinating to see how, I think that structure of stories probably has become slightly more narrow now. It would be really hard to pitch this book now.
Yeah, if we took it to an agent, they'd be like, well, you need to make the person more active. They need to have more agency. They can't just be drifting from place to place. So, but there are certain classics like this that people keep revisiting. And obviously, like yourself, they come back and find something new. So we get lots of TV and filmed adaptations. But there are other classics that I've read more recently and thought, it doesn't echo in the same way as something like War of the Worlds does. So, an example I come to is Stranger in a Strange Land. I read that maybe only 7 or 8 years ago, and I could see why it was important at the time that it was published because of the content of the story. I don't want to spoil anything, but reading it today, I thought, it didn't strike me as nearly as powerful as it probably was when it first came out. But War of the Worlds and even The Time Machine, there's still that thing of, the Eloi and the clashes between with The Time Machine that's still relevant today.
It's interesting. I mean, I think this was something you mentioned in one of the other podcasts, but there is a... I mean, do you think it's something to do with the time, the age that you are when you read something as well, that it has a stronger impact when you're in those formative teenage years? I think sometimes something has a real punch to the gut, whereas you can read something much later in life and it doesn't quite have the same impact. Yeah,
there are certain things that I think will always have an impact on a person. And I think when we said this on a previous episode, you can read the same book at a different age and it'll echo in a different way because you're not the same person. But if it can keep doing that for you at different ages, then there's definitely a lot of content, a lot of material that's worth revisiting. But some books, I don't know, they work at the moment, and then when you come back to them, they don't strike the same chord anymore.
That's true. Having said that, a book that almost made my list, which I'll just briefly mention, which I tried to read when I was 14, was 1984. And I really struggled, and I put it aside, and I didn't come back to it until I was, I think I was past 40 when I read it. And but the impact of that book still has so much to say and so much strength to it that it immediately became one of my top 5 favorite books, and I'm sure that's something that I'm going to be rereading hopefully into my old age. So I think some books can still have that amazing impact, and I guess sometimes maybe you have to be the right age to read something. So reading 1984 in my 40s said a lot to me, whereas when I was trying to read it when I was 14, I just didn't get it.
It's true. I've got friends with kids who say, oh, they can't read certain things or they can't watch certain films now because if a child is put in danger, they just can't do it. Whereas in their 20s, they'd be like, yeah, that's fine. I don't mind watching that film. It hasn't got the same weight. But now they're like, the child's in danger. I can't watch that or read that. And it's true. You change and material changes for you.
That's true. Absolutely right.
Okay, tell me about your second choice.
My second choice is Empty World by John Christopher. A lot of people might have heard of John Christopher because of his science fiction children's stories, specifically the Tripods trilogy. They're obviously inspired by the War of the Worlds, the Tripods trilogy. But Empty World is a standalone story. I've read lots of John Christopher, and I was lucky enough to speak to him via email a few times before he died. But Empty World it's a standalone story, and it was a contemporary story about a young boy who was called Niel, which is I think part of the reason why it probably appealed to me.
Yeah.
I think it was the first story, probably the last story I've ever read with a main character called Niel. But it's about a young boy who is he's been orphaned. I think from memory, I think his parents died in a car crash, and but then again in a similar sort of way to the War of the Worlds, he's swept along by these events. There's a plague comes along, and it's sort of an aging plague. So it hits all of the people who are the grandparents, the old people, and it accelerates their aging process, and they become kind of withered and they die within a few weeks. But then the plague mutates and starts to affect parents. So suddenly people in their 30s and 40s start to become old people, and they suddenly become old and die. And this all sort of happens in the first few chapters, and then it passes down to children. And so then he's going to school and he sees somebody who's got this, and he looks like a little old man, and basically everybody starts to die. So the title of the book, Empty World, is basically about the fact that there are very few people left, and the only people left are children. So there are 1 or 2 children here and there who are immune for whatever reason, and Niel, the main character, is immune. And it's a book, I go into schools and talk about writing and my books and things like that. And it's a story I always mention to them because everyone sort of has this wish when they're young to be kind of freed from the shackles of parents and people telling them what to do, school teachers and all of that. But that's exactly what happens in this book. Niel is left alone without anyone to support him. So you get the downside of that as well. He's got to fend for himself. He's got to feed himself. So it has that sort of vibe of the popular things like The Walking Dead and things like that, but without zombies. It's got this plague that has killed everyone off. And it doesn't pull its punches. This is what I really liked about it, is that he's alone for so long. And he's this, there's one part, I'm going to spoil it slightly, this part, but I'll try not to spoil the whole book for you. But there's one part where he hears a bell ringing. He's in London, and he hears this bell ringing, one of the clock towers, so he knows somebody else is alive. And it takes him a while to get there. And then eventually when he gets there, this person has hung themselves because they've given up. They've realized that this was their last desperate attempt to find somebody else alive. So he has this horrible moment of discovering this other child who's lost all hope and taken their own life. So there's lots of these little kind of moments, these events that happen. And eventually he does meet some other people, but they're not particularly, it's not like he's everything goes well at that stage. And there is no real resolution to the story. There's again, I won't spoil it any further than that because I would encourage you to read it. But the resolution of the story is so open-ended. And again, it's a character who has not had any impact upon the problem that has affected the world. He's just dealing with it. And I absolutely love that structure and that story. And I've reread it a few times since, and it still has a lot of strength to it. And it's not a widely read book. There's not many people who've heard of it. I picked it up in the library at school, recommended to me by a friend at the time who was a much faster reader than me. And yeah, I just think it's such a fantastic story. And I think it has been recently. It was out of print for a long time, but I think it might be back in print again. So it's worth trying to find it if you can.
It's interesting because it's, from hearing you talk about it, and did some reading about it as well, and it said that it is very firmly aimed at an adolescent audience. It's not, that's who it was designed for. And hearing you talk about it, it's almost like it sounds like a precursor to what we'd call today young adult or sort of more mature fiction for children.
In some ways it is, yeah. I'm sure, again, it's interesting how the publishing landscape has changed because he probably wouldn't, it probably would have been classed as young adult. But from memory, I think the character is not that old. I mean, he might be 12, and there's certainly nothing... there's no swearing, there's nothing like that in there, but the content and the tone of it is very, very dark. And but again, that was, I think this, I can't remember exactly when it came out, maybe 84 or something like that. But
it's first published in 77.
Oh, really? Okay, so maybe it was about 82, 83 then. That maybe I'm thinking when I read it was maybe 83, 84 that I read it. And it feels very much of that time, the kind of the fear of the Cold War and everything else like that. But it has that sense of doom about it, which, again, you wonder whether you would get away with it quite in the same way these days. It would be, you'd have to skew it slightly older these days, maybe.
Yeah. A lot of people say that children are now smarter than they were back there. Do you think they are? Or is it just that they're more aware because of the way the world is connected? Because this sort of a book could be published today with a few things, a few updates, as you say, and it would work. It would absolutely work.
I think so, yeah. I mean, in some ways, I think children are more mature in certain ways. But it's interesting. I mean, my I've got two teenage daughters, and as we're recording this is we've just had the Trump do the strikes in Syria because of the chemical gas attacks. So that's just happened sort of about a week ago, and my teenage daughter, has been there's been so many messages coming through on social media, on her phone, between her friends about that we're all going to die, and it's the end of the world, and the Queen has been airlifted out of the country, and all really quite scaremongery type things that I thought would belonged in the past, that kind of rumor mongering. I remember things about nuclear war when I was at school, and it would be gossip in the playground. It just seems like that gossip has now moved into a digital sphere rather than being in outside in the yard. So I think the same fears are there, and I think the same for want of a better word, naivety, that's we have as children, I think, is still there, and that my daughter said to me, well, if I do die, all I've done is revise for exams, and she has this desperate urge, quite rightly, to do more with her life, and I'm reassuring her, saying, no, it won't happen. Don't be silly, it's fine. But I remember having exactly those same fears at about the same age, so maybe things aren't that different. Maybe there's a kind of an icing of technology over the top, but we've got the same primal fears and the same urges and desires that we've always had as children. So I guess the same stories can work now as they did when we were growing up, and our parents and grandparents when they were that age as well.
I remember reading some books when I was a kid that really talked down to me that I really didn't like, but it's the ones that just had more mature content like this. They polished off some of the sharper edges, so there wasn't the obvious swearing or sex or any kind of overt violence, and yet it still dealt with the serious issues. And it was almost those sort of things took place off the page, but you knew roughly what was happening, that you remember the most, because they're dealing with real things, but they don't then talk down to the reader.
That's true. I think you're right. I think those books that make you think are always the ones that seem to stick with you the longest. And sometimes, when you look back, and I think it's the same with TV shows, you look back and think, "Oh my God, how did they get away with that then?" Or how But I think it's good to challenge people in storytelling. I think that's what it should be doing.
The team you talk about this book as well reminded me of Z for Zachariah.
Oh, yeah.
Which is another one about a plague where I think the main characters are adults, but it's that thing of, we read it in school, where there's only a couple of people left, and now that they're trying to survive in a world, and just it's all to do with the nature of people and humanity, and not necessarily the plague itself. Yeah,
I think John Christopher in particular was slightly obsessed with plagues and the end of the world, because one of his more famous books is The Death of Grass, which is an adult book. I think it's a Penguin book, and that's about, there's a plague, some sort of disease that kills wheat. So it kills all of the variants of grass. So basically we have a huge problem with food production, and society breaks down very quickly there. And it's all about somebody who goes to, it's a bit of a kind of prepper's story, somebody who goes and hides away on the family farm and defends him and his family from the rest of society. So, his books in particular, there are quite a few where society is broken down. There's another one I think it's called the Prince in Waiting trilogy, which is set in the future, but it's all to do with, it's a really interesting mix of kind of druids, a bit of new agey stone circles and mysticism, and I think there's been a nuclear holocaust as well, and it's all about this character who is he's almost a King Arthur type character, and it's about his life, and it's set over 3 books, but there's sort of a secret society that hold all the old technology that was from our society that's been lost, and they wield it a bit like magic. So he was definitely obsessed, I think, as lots of us are, with society collapsing.
Yeah, very positive.
Very positive. Absolutely, yeah. Seek him out.
Yeah, it sounds like a good book. Okay, so tell us about your third choice. This is quite different, and it's the first one of this type that we've had so far.
Yeah, this is a graphic novel. My life is, I've always read graphic novels. I've always read comics, should I say. It started off with Star Wars Weekly when I was about 6 or 7. And I love graphic novels. I love comics as a narrative form. I think they are a really interesting way of telling a story. And I've never been a particularly fast reader, so a comic is a really, really good way for me to absorb a story in a short period of time. So the book I've chosen it's a collection of a comic strip that I read. Again, this is there's a theme emerging here, but this was probably when I was about 13, 14, and it's the collection is called Miracle Man: A Dream of Flying, and it's by Alan Moore, who's the writer, and Gary Leach and Alan Davis, who are the artists on it. A lot of people will have heard of Alan Moore from Watchmen, and this is a precursor to that. So this is dealing with superheroes, and it's him deconstructing superheroes before he did that in Watchmen. Yeah. So it started life as Marvel Man in a comic called Warrior, and Marvel Man was a 50s pulp UK superhero. And when Warriors started, they brought him back and they reinvented him for the 80s. But because Alan Moore is Alan Moore, he deconstructed him. So he started off with the character had forgotten he was a superhero, and then eventually through the first episode was he remembered this secret trigger word that he had, which allowed him to transform into Marvel Man. So there was kind of this alter ego thing going on, but it wasn't just a curl of the hair and a pair of glasses. It was, he said his keyword and he literally swapped bodies. So he went from in Alan Moore's version, he went from being a 40-year-old man, overweight, with the problems of life and paying his bills on his shoulders, to being this beautiful, handsome 20-something muscled superhero. And over the period of this first collection and into the second and third collection, Alan Moore pulls apart every single kind of trope of the superhero story, and he justifies this character having these abilities. So basically, what he manages to do is turn it into a 60s British secret project in an X-Files kind of way of taking a crashed UFO and reverse engineering their technology to create an Uberman, a kind of perfect specimen of the human race that has these powers. And it was the first time I'd seen that. I was reading comics at that period and starting to read American comics as well. But it was the first time that I'd seen somebody deconstruct something in that way and really take it seriously. He took something that was quite trivial and really took it seriously, and made everything work. It felt like somebody pulling an old clock apart and polishing all the bits and turning it into the most wonderful kind of digital clock that you'd ever seen. So he made it better than it was to start with, but also made you really think about how these things might work. And I guess, like a lot of people, I've had dreams on and off of flying. I don't. Do you have that, Steve? Is that something you've had?
Sometimes I dream of flying. I've never had the one where all my teeth fall out, which people seem to have a lot.
Oh, I've had that. I've had my teeth falling out a lot. Dreams of flying, turning up to school naked, and weirdly, a recurring one for me is corridors that are too narrow, or doors that are like half submersion water, and things that are like health and safety nightmares in a way that would make the Star Wars universe look quite safe. It's not just missing railings, it's kind of walkways that are on slants and buildings that are open to the elements. But anyway, so I've had dreams of flying before, and it tapped into that, and it was part of the inspiration for a young adult story that I wrote called Altitude, which is about a young girl who discovers she could fly. So it has. This book is a favourite of mine, but part of the reason I've chosen it for our crash scenario is that I do think, the art is beautiful, and I do think that that blend of visuals and words is a really beautiful way of telling a story. So I think we really need to have some graphic novels on this planet.
I think the first time I came across someone taking the stuff really seriously or doing something unique with it would have been Frank Miller with The Dark Knight Returns.
Yes.
Because up to before then I'd been reading Marvel and DC, and it was all fun and action and adventure, and there wasn't that serious tone to some of the comics, not all of them, because it doesn't work for all of them. And that was the first time I'd seen someone say, okay, Batman's been doing it for this many years, his body's broken, he's old, he's tired, he's worn out, and he had to finally retire, and that's where the book kind of starts, for those who haven't read it. And it was that made me go, okay, right, there's other ways of doing it, and gradually that awareness has filtered into the main culture now that people are aware of comics. But when we were growing up, it was very much whiz bang, the kind of Batman TV series type thing.
Yeah, exactly right. I think comics were changing about that time. Miracle Man and Dark Knight Returns, or Marvel Man at the time, were probably, I think, within a year of each other. But that period did see a real spark of creative revolution in comics, because I remember reading comics at the time was something that was slightly embarrassed about, certainly in public, and not within certain circles of friends, but it wasn't the mainstream juggernaut that it is now. But at that time, you're right. You had obviously Dark Knight Returns, and then into Watchmen as well, and all of that sort of groundbreaking stuff that went on in the format around about that time. I mean, I almost, instead of this, my other choice was going to be V for Vendetta, because that's a huge influence as well. But all of that stuff was going on around about that time, sort of mid '80s and into the '90s, and I do think it's a golden age.
I think a lot of people discount comics, those who don't read them, because it's difficult to know where to begin. They might be aware of the characters because of TV shows, films, or even animated things, and then they go, right, well, where do I start? And because comics never really ends, the mainstream Marvel and DC, it's always second act. It's hard to know, but these standalone one-offs that are complete stories, I think, are really satisfying. And
yeah, I think that's true. Yeah, I think from the outside it can look like a bit of an impenetrable wall, really, can't it? Because there's so much of it. Even if you go into a specialist comic shop now, it's quite overwhelming, isn't it?
Yeah, there's always a new number one out, and you go, well, which one? But number one do I read?
Yeah, how many times can you reboot a universe?
Yeah, but right, well, that's our first comic, our first graphic novel. Interesting. Okay, tell me about your fourth choice.
Okay, my fourth choice. This depends, Steve. If you're going to be really, it depends how vicious you're going to be with me, because I was wanting to put in the Foundation series by Isaac Asimov, but if we're going to be really lenient, then it's going to be the first book, isn't it? Mm-hmm. You tell me.
How many books is there in this series?
Well, there's the first three is the Foundation trilogy, but then there are more beyond that. There was a prequel, and I think there are 2 or 3 after the original trilogy as well. So I can't, if memory serves, it's either 5 or 6 books in total. But we could go with the trilogy if that's a good.
Yeah. Tell me about the Foundation series, because this isn't one I've read. I have read others by this author who can explain, but I've not read this series.
Well, Isaac Asimov, I think this was possibly the first book that I read by Isaac Asimov, and I've since gone on to read lots and lots of his work, because, I mean, he was hugely prolific for one thing, but also the ideas are so good. So the Foundation series, or the Foundation trilogy, is set in the dim and distant future, and it's focused on a guy called Harry Seldon, who is a psychotherapist, I think. Not a psychotherapist. What's it called? Not psychotherapist. I've forgotten the name of it now. But he deals with something called psychohistory, which is basically, the idea behind it is that he can. It's herd mentality, basically. Through his calculations, he can predict the outcome of. Or the events of the future by calculating what we as a population will do. So he can't predict individuals, but as a mass, as a herd, he can predict where we're going to go. And basically, he predicts that in several, I can't remember, 10,000 years or something like 100,000 years, the empire will collapse. Basically, mankind has spread itself out across the galaxy over thousands of worlds, and he is predicting that within a period of time, the great and bountiful empire will collapse, and we will descend into a dark age of barbarism. And what he wants to do is set up this foundation which will shorten that dark age. So he says we can't avoid this descent. But we can, by the work of the Foundation, we can go about preserving our culture and society and shorten that to a millennia, so that we will return again as a new empire. Now, he's seen as a heretic, even though this is set in the future and we're enlightened and we've got technology. Because he's talking about the collapse of society, he's seen as a heretic and as somebody who's just talking crazy nonsense. But what I really love about it is this character had even second guessed that they would accuse him of this, and he planned for that as well. And the story follows. It goes beyond. The first book is sort of told in chunks of time, and he as a character is in it as a living character, is in it for only a short period of the book, but then it jumps, hundreds of years forwards, and we see the progression of the Foundation and the corruption of the Foundation, and then there's another second Foundation comes into it as well. I don't want to spoil it too much, but basically, it's what I really love about it was the mechanics of the storytelling, in that he thought this thing through. And it's tremendous world building, and he's managed to really draw you into something that is quite outside our normal experience, but is still relatable. And it made it feel very, very exciting as well. So yeah, I just absolutely love it for its descriptive writing and its world building, and his storytelling is second to none. So he's one of my favourite authors, as is Arthur C. Clarke, and again, the Foundation series has had a huge influence on my own writing as well. So if you've not read it, I would certainly recommend it.
So I've read things like The Caves of Steel and some of those books by Asimov, but not this. But so in looking into this series, Foundation series, or the first few books anyways, it was first published from 1942 to 1950. It was sort of coming out around that time. And when I think about this book, and I think about Lord of the Rings, and even C.S. Lewis with the Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe books, I think they're almost a response to the conflict from World War II.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. I mean, I haven't looked into it too deeply, but there's certainly a feel of that anxiety there, I guess. Yeah, and I'm sure that must be a response to what's going on at the time. That huge cultures will collapse. It doesn't matter how strong and structured and stable we think we are. Every empire falls. Every society changes. There was something I was listening to the other week about. Basically, a guy was saying that democracy, as we see it, is the same as all of the other structures of society, of the past. That it's in its decline, and something else will come along to replace democracy, which was kind of shocking to think about. But I thought, well, yeah, it sort of makes sense as well.
If this book is all about preserving stuff in the present for the future, it seems to really echo the idea of, we've just gone through this terrible war and look at everything we've lost. We need to think further ahead than the next war. We need to think about, okay, in 100 years and 200 years, what can we save, what can we preserve to keep the human race going? And I thought, especially with Tolkien and with Lord of the Rings, but this in particular, about the idea of preservation. Doesn't he sort of try and collect knowledge from specialists? Isn't that part of the book?
Yeah, I mean, there's the later books as well. He goes on to, or another character goes on to try and find the mother planet, to go back to Earth, and he brings in kind of Gaian ideas as well into it. But the main thread for me is there's huge kind of political aspects of these of Harry Seldon as a character manoeuvring himself and his organization to try and stave off this downfall, and then the narrow sightedness or the short sightedness of the people who are opposing him. But yeah, it taps into lots of things, and he goes into mental abilities at one point as well. So there's a lot in there. There's a lot to like, absolutely.
And I know a lot of people have cited this as being an inspiration and an influence on them, and even some of the sort of futurists now, like people like Elon Musk, has said it was very important to him. And I think a copy of this book was in his car that was part of the first launch of the heavy rocket thing that he did recently.
I didn't know that, but that doesn't surprise me.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, it does. I mean, it talks. You're right. It talks about preservation and, how easy it is to lose things that we presume are, here forever. And, he sets out his stall at the beginning by just, the capital planet that this starts on. He describes that in great detail and talks about these spires of sort of skyscrapers. It's very Coruscant, obviously, long before we ever saw that on screen, but it's that feel. And the way he describes it, you'd think, well, there's no way this could ever collapse, but of course it can, and he warns about it, and eventually that is exactly what happens. So yeah, there's quite a strong message in there. I think there's still a warning for us now, really, even though that book is 80 years old, near enough.
Yeah. There again, I think is one that's very relevant and apt to today with everything. The world is more complex and conflict has changed, but it seems to have just evolved into something else. We don't have these huge warring fronts. We now have lots of smaller wars and things, but still stuff is lost all the time. How many sites have we seen torn down, historic value, never to be rebuilt or never to be see the likes again? So yes, preservation is definitely an important thing in today's world.
Absolutely, yeah, you're right.
Okay, so let's tell you your last choice, something a bit more uplifting to end on.
A little, yes, exactly. It's like gear change. We've gone from alien invasions to plagues to genetic engineering through to the collapse of empires. My final choice is The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. I probably don't need to say very much. I mean, I guess most people have either heard or have read this. I mean, interestingly, I came to this by the book. It wasn't through the radio series,
right,
which preceded it. So I read the book first, and then went back and then I think the TV series came on, and then I listened to the audio years later. But it's just such good fun. I mean, but it also it's full of clever ideas. You know, if you strip away the comedy, it's very, very good science fiction. But then you've got this huge layer on top of really cleverly observed humor. So it's, if you want a cross section of, for me, the kind of books that I love, but also the things that I think make us what we are, humor is a huge part of that. I think without that, we're a fairly boring species.
True.
So I think absolutely there had to be something, I wouldn't necessarily say lighter, but funnier on this list. And The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is one that I still reread often. I often just pick it up and read a few pages and put it back, and there's always something that I've forgotten or something funny and clever in there. And obviously, it's such a shame that we still haven't got Douglas Adams to be writing more. But having said that, who knows if he'd have written any more? He was so slow at these things. But The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is such a funny and clever book. I guess for anyone who's not read it, do you want me to say a little bit about what the story's about?
A little, but I think
okay.
A little bit.
I mean, boiling it down, it's a human at the point of the Earth being destroyed, and again, I guess there's elements of preserving something there that you see in the Foundation series, and then he goes on an adventure around the galaxy. That's as much as you need to know, really, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, Douglas Adams was such a unique writer, and he's so clever and so funny. I think he's one of these once-in-a-generation writers that comes along that has something so unique that they are their own genre in a way. And the other one that I think of that sadly we lost only a few years ago is Terry Pratchett.
Absolutely.
Because there again, you've got something that's very, very fantasy-based in a very detailed fantasy world, but you strip that back, and there's so much social commentary, and you can point at some of his books and say, that one's about the post office, that one's about banking, and it's just, direct correlation between current world events and what's going on in fantasy with this wonderful sense of humour that some people are sometimes unable to see past the fantastic to what he's actually talking about.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think he had a lot to say, and maybe sometimes the humour means that people aren't really looking at them in the way that they are, full of clever ideas. But I mean, it's such a shame we haven't got dozens more books by him. But I mean, I think if you wanted to pick a book that would kind of exemplify the human race, I think from my list, I think The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is probably the one that is closest to it, because it captures the ridiculousness of us.
That's the word, ridiculousness. Yeah,
I mean, it is. is, you've got bureaucracy in there, and the whole build-up of the Vogon constructor fleet, and then him saying, well, the plans have been freely available to see for several months, and mirroring that with his own house being destroyed, and the plans being hidden in a basement, and all of those brilliant, clever observations on the stupid bureaucracy of life and the absurdness of being a human being is all in there. Mm-hmm. Brilliant stuff.
Yeah, it's just so good. And if you've not read Hitchhikers, then I definitely recommend going out. And just if you want something that's funny and silly, but very, very clever too, from a very unique voice, it's definitely worth reading.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, unfortunately, as you know, I'm now going to crash land you on an alien world. However, you do get to choose what kind of a planet you would like, and even if there's a particular world, although someone did cheat on a previous episode, which hasn't come out yet, but we'll get to that. So what type of a world would you like to crash land on?
Well, I've been giving this a bit of thought, and initially I was thinking something along the lines of almost like a tropical holiday, but I've decided against that. Because I think the thing I would miss most of all is some interaction and conversation. Yeah. So what I'd like is a planet with some form of intelligent life on there. That could be biological, it could be a machine race, but some sort of sentient race that is benevolent, so that I don't want to be dissected.
Right.
But what I'd be quite happy if I was in some kind of institution, for want of a better word, but somewhere where they can learn from me and I can learn from them, and I wouldn't be prodded and poked too much, and ideally would have a breathable atmosphere for me, but somewhere where I could have some I could learn something. I think is the main thing, is that maybe I could almost be kind of telling them about the culture of the Earth, and they could tell me all about their most interesting things. So if I could choose a planet, it would be something that has a benevolent population.
A little bit Slaughterhouse-5 then.
Yeah, possibly. I don't mind being in a zoo potentially, as long as I get to talk to people. I don't mind that.
Interesting. There's more about the interactions than the actual place.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, I don't even mind if it's it would be nice if it's nice and sunny. Actually, the other thing would be, it would be lovely if it was quite different. So it was a binary star system, or maybe had 8 moons, something that isn't the norm to here, but isn't going to kill me. I would quite like to survive and breathe and be able to eat, and not to have things put into me to be cut up, to be electrocuted and tested.
Okay,
it's a long list. I know.
A long list. I think it's reasonably fair that you don't want to be experimented on your alien world. I think that's a fair thing. It's fair. I'll allow it.
Thank you.
Well, anyway, thank you for telling us about your choices, and thanks for coming on Crash Landing.
Thank you, Steve. It's been a pleasure.
My thanks to Niel Bushnell for joining me this episode. If you'd like to find out more about his books, then visit nielbushnell.com, where there's information about his Arkship novels for adults, his young adult books, and also his books for children. The first 3 Arkship books are out at the moment, and the 4th will be out later this year. Thank you for listening, and if you'd like to support this podcast and all of the others on the Geek Syndicate network, then please go to patreon.com/Geek Syndicate.